I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the message on my son's phone, the one he forgot to hide when he rushed out that morning, because the words weren't from a person who loved him. They were from someone who saw him as a step towards something bigger, and the tone cut straight into my chest. And that single moment pushed me into a decision I had never imagined for myself, a decision that led me to her house, pretending to be someone I was not, moving like a quiet shadow instead of the woman everyone knows. And before I go deeper into what happened that day, let me say this clearly. My name is Janet, and if you find comfort or value in hearing my truth, you can share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because this story isn't light, it isn't pretty, and the way it unfolded still makes me sit in silence some nights, wondering how I didn't see the signs sooner. And the reason this story began at all is simple. I wanted to see my son's lover with my own eyes, not as the polished girl he spoke about, but as the girl she was when no one important was watching. So I tied a scarf low on my forehead, wore old clothes, and walked to her house like a housekeeper looking for extra work, wanting to blend into the corners and catch the truth that people hide from mothers. And when I reached her gate, I paused for a second, thinking about how strange it was for me to lower myself like this. But the fear of my son walking into the wrong life was stronger than my pride. So I knocked, and the door opened to a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried irritation even before I spoke. And she didn't ask who I was. She just looked at my shoes like she already decided I wasn't worth greeting, pointing me inside like I was a pair of hands and nothing more. And as I stepped in, the first thing that struck me wasn't the house, but the feeling, a kind of coldness under all the decoration, a silence that told me people smiled here only when they needed something. And before I had time to settle, I heard her, my son's lover, speaking from the living room in a tone I had never heard from her when she faced my son, a tone full of judgment, full of hidden plans. And then she mentioned him casually, like he was a tool. And I felt something in me twist. And the more I listened, the more I realized I wasn't prepared for what I was hearing, because what she said next made my legs feel weak. And in that single moment, I understood that I didn't come here too early. I came here too late, because the trap had already been set. I stood there with a cloth in my hand, pretending to wipe the edge of a table, but my ears were fixed on her voice as she walked closer, speaking to her mother about my son like he was some simple boy she could bend, saying he was easy to manage and useful for now. And those words slid into me like cold metal, yet I kept my face straight, because a housekeeper has no right to react. And the more they talked, the more I understood why my son never saw their true nature, because they only showed him softness, the kind that hides sharp edges. And as I watched the girl from the corner of my eye, I noticed something I had missed even in photos he showed me. The way she rolled her eyes at her own mother, the way her smile disappeared when she thought no one was looking, a spoiled kind of anger sitting right under her skin. And then her mother asked her if she was sure she could lock him down. And the girl laughed, not a warm laugh, but a small, harsh sound, saying that once she got what she needed, his feelings won't matter. And I gripped the cloth so tight my fingers trembled, but I still stayed quiet, standing there like the invisible woman I decided to be, letting them believe I was nothing more than someone picking crumbs from their floor, because I needed to hear more. I needed to understand the plan they were working on behind the sweet messages they sent my son. And as they moved toward the living room, they dropped their voices, but I followed slowly, pretending to dust the frame of a picture on the wall. And from that angle, I caught their next words clearly, the mother saying she wanted her daughter to marry into a family with money, but also with someone who could be controlled. And the girl replied that my son was perfect for that, because he wanted love more than he wanted anything else. She said it like it was a flaw to be used, not a gift to be honored. And when she added that she couldn't wait to make him depend on her so he would never leave, something inside me pressed down hard, because I knew that tone. I knew that craving for power. And I had seen people like this before, people who smile with their mouths and hurt with their hands. And as I stood there, trying to stay calm, the girl suddenly turned her head and looked straight at me, sharp and suspicious, asking who let me in. And for one moment, my heart stopped, because if she sensed even a little of who I was, everything would fall apart right there. So I lowered my eyes, kept my voice soft, and whispered that I was only cleaning the rooms I was told to clean. And she stared at me for a full second, the kind of stare that strips people down. Then she smirked and told me to bring her a glass of water. And as she turned away, I knew I needed to walk deeper into this lie, because something in that house was darker than I expected, and I wasn't leaving until I found it. Even if it meant risking everything. I carried the glass toward her with steady hands, though my chest felt tight. And as I stepped into the living room, I saw her lounging on the sofa while her mother counted something on a small notebook, numbers circled, arrows drawn, and I didn't need to stare long to know they weren't grocery lists. These were plans, financial plans, and my son's name kept appearing in their murmured sentences, like a tool being measured, not a person being loved. So I placed the water gently on the table, keeping my head bowed, and as I turned away, I caught a whisper. "She doesn't look like the housekeepers we usually hire." And her mother replied, "Cheap help comes in all shapes." And they laughed together, soft, cruel laughter, the kind that fills a room with a smell you can't wash out. And it took everything in me to keep walking, to keep playing the role I came here to play, because every instinct in me wanted to stand up and tell them who I was. But doing that would shut the door on the truth I still hadn't reached. And as I moved toward the hallway, I overheard them start talking about a dinner they were planning, something important, something that involved my son being presented to someone as if he was a trophy. And I leaned closer without making a sound, wiping a shelf already clean just to stay near them. And the mother said she wanted him to meet their relatives soon, because wealth attracts wealth. And her daughter added that once he was tied to her, everything else would fall into place. And when she asked if they should push him to propose soon, the mother said, "Not yet. Let him think it's his choice." And those words pushed a pulse of heat through me, because manipulation said that sentence, not love. Just when I thought I had heard the worst, the girl mentioned something that stopped me cold. She wanted to visit my home next week, not to see him, but to scan the environment and judge what she would have to deal with. And she said it with this careless tone, the kind that stripped dignity from a house she had never even stepped into. And I felt this slow, heavy breath move through me, because she had no idea she was talking about the home where I raised my children with the little I had, the home that held every struggle, every step, every memory. And she called it something she needed to evaluate. She was a buyer inspecting a product. And before I could gather my thoughts, she stood up suddenly, walking toward the hallway where I stood. And I froze for half a second, rearranging my face into nothingness. And when she passed me, she didn't say a single word. She just looked at me with that same cold smirk, like she saw me as part of the furniture. And then she opened a door at the end of the hall, the only room I hadn't stepped into yet. And I saw the look she gave her mother before closing it, a look that told me whatever was inside, that room wasn't meant to be seen by anyone like me. And that was the moment I knew I needed to get inside it, no matter what it cost, because the truth was hiding behind that door. I waited till their footsteps moved further into the kitchen before I walked slowly toward that closed door. Each step measured, each breath held low in my chest, because something about the way she shut that door told me it held the truth they didn't want anyone to touch. And when I reached it, I laid my hand on the knob, pretending to dust it. But the metal was warm, which meant someone had just been inside. And as I leaned closer, I heard a soft clicking sound from within, like drawers opening, paper sliding, a faint hum of a laptop, and my heart pushed against my ribs, because housekeepers are never allowed near personal rooms, especially not one that they kept guarded like a vault. But if I walked away, I would be leaving clues behind that might never come again. So I waited until the kitchen faucet turned on noise to cover my move, and I gently tried the knob, but it didn't turn, locked from the inside. And that told me more than anything else could, because people don't lock harmless rooms. People don't guard simple spaces. And as I stepped back, I heard the girl's voice rise slightly from behind the door, sharp and annoyed, telling someone on a video call that she didn't want my son to know anything yet. And then she said something that tightened my throat. He's useful right now, but I need to know exactly how much I can get from this connection. And hearing the word connection instead of relationship made something shift deep inside me. But I forced myself to stay calm, because a reaction would break everything. So I moved toward the edge of the hallway as the door opened suddenly, and she stepped out holding a file in her hand, a thin folder with a gold clip. And before she noticed me, I saw a glimpse of its label, something written with my son's initials, and she pressed it against her chest, as if she needed to protect it from the air itself. And then she looked at me with narrowed eyes, asking why I was near her room. And for a moment, I felt the lie press against my tongue, but I kept my voice low and steady, saying I was only checking which rooms needed cleaning. And she stared so long, I could feel my skin prickle. But then she shrugged, the careless kind of shrug someone gives when they believe they are smarter than you. And she told me to clean the upstairs guest room next, a room far from where the real secrets were kept. She turned away without waiting for my reply, walking back toward her mother, whispering something I couldn't hear. And I stood alone in that hallway, staring at the locked door that held my son's initials inside. And I knew now that whatever plan they had was deeper than simple greed, something calculated, something organized, something they didn't want anyone, not even him, to see. And as I climbed the stairs slowly, pretending to obey her order, I made a quiet promise to myself, a promise that felt heavy but steady in my chest. I would get back into that room, and when I did, nothing in this house would stay hidden. The stairs creaked under my feet as I went up, each sound reminding me that I wasn't meant to be here, not as myself and not as the woman I was pretending to be. But I kept climbing anyway, because my son's name on that file would not leave my mind. And when I reached the guest room she wanted me to clean, I stood inside it for a moment, letting the silence settle long enough for me to think. And the first thought that hit me was simple. If she trusted me enough to send me upstairs alone, then she didn't take me seriously. And that was the advantage I needed. So I opened the closet door quietly, not to clean, but to find something, a window, a mirror, a line of sight that might help me later. And inside the closet, I found something that made me pause, not because it was shocking, but because it was too perfect, too arranged. The room was staged for someone specific, maybe for a meeting or a stay that hadn't happened yet. And as I touched the edge of a suitcase sitting on the top shelf, I felt a strange weight inside it, like documents or devices, not clothes. And before I could check further, I heard footsteps downstairs, quick and firm, as if something had shifted in their mood, and I moved away from the closet instantly, picking up a cloth and pretending to dust the dresser when the girl's mother called out from below, her voice sharper than earlier, asking her daughter if she had hidden the file properly, and her daughter replied that she put it where no fool would look. And that sentence made me breathe very slow, because fools are invisible in their world, and they believed I was one, which meant they would never imagine the housekeeper standing upstairs was listening to every single word. And as they continued talking, the mother mentioned someone else, a man coming later that evening to check the progress. And when the daughter asked if she needed to act more gentle around my son, the mother said, "Act, however, keeps him blinded." And I felt something inside me crack a little, because they were playing with his heart like it was a loose coin on their table. And the next sentence pulled me closer to the doorway. Without thinking, they said that if everything went right, they would gain access to something they had been waiting for years to reach. And I knew instantly they weren't talking about love or marriage or any dream my son might have. They were talking about money, influence, control, and whatever plan they were building had steps, layers, and people involved, not just the two of them. And as I leaned forward, trying to hear more, the mother suddenly asked her daughter to bring the file back downstairs so she could hide it somewhere safer. And I felt my stomach tighten, because the file was coming out of that room again, the room I had no access to, the room holding the truth I came for. And I knew this was my only chance to get close before it disappeared into another locked drawer. So I stepped out of the guest room slowly, quiet as breath, and as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw her, my son's lover, standing below with the file in her hand again, tapping it lightly against her leg. And when she lifted her eyes and looked up at the stairs, her gaze landed right on me, long and suspicious, and for a moment, it felt like she could see through my disguise, see the mother under the humble clothes. And I froze in place, because if she asked me one wrong question, everything would fall apart. And she had already opened her mouth to speak. She stared up at me like she was measuring every inch of my silence, her hand still resting on that file, as if it was more precious than the truth inside it. And for a second, the whole house felt too still, too watchful, like even the walls were waiting for my next breath. But I forced my face into that quiet, harmless expression a housekeeper is expected to wear, and I asked softly if she needed anything else cleaned, letting my voice tremble just enough to look ordinary. And she tilted her head, studying me longer than she should have, then said she didn't remember telling me to stand on the stairs like a statue. And she smirked as she said it, as if making me small gave her comfort. And I apologized gently, stepping down one stair at a time, slow, controlled, keeping my eyes lowered. But inside me, everything was running, every thought pushing toward the folder she was gripping, because I needed to know what was inside it, why it had my son's initials, why they spoke about him like he was part of a plan instead of a person. And as I reached the bottom of the stairs, she shifted the file to her other hand and moved closer, too close, close enough for me to see her expression change into something sharper, something curious. And she asked where I worked before this, her voice wrapped in a fake sweetness that didn't match the question. And I realized she wasn't really asking about work. She was testing me, checking if I had a story prepared. But I kept my voice steady and simple, saying I worked in private homes, quiet ones, and I never caused trouble. And she blinked slowly, as if weighing every word I said, then asked how I managed to find their address. And I told her her mother's friend sent me. A lie so soft it sounded boring, and boring lies are the ones people believe first. And after a long breath, she decided I wasn't interesting enough to worry about, turning away again. And that small dismissal told me something vital. She thought she was safe around me, unchallenged, unseen, and that made her careless, the kind of careless that reveals cracks. And as she walked toward her mother with the file, I followed at a respectful distance, hiding how my eyes never left that thin folder. And they began whispering again, fast and low. But this time their words weren't about my son. They were about someone else, someone they were meeting later in the evening, someone they needed to convince. And the mother said, once he signs, everything becomes easier. And when the daughter asked what they would do if my son asked questions, the mother said, he won't. People like him don't see danger in front of them. And that sentence tightened something inside my chest, because I raised my son to trust people, to see good first. And now that softness was being used as a trap. And before I could pull away from my thoughts, the front door opened, and a tall man stepped inside, confident, casual, as if he belonged to their secrets. And both women straightened quickly, hiding the file in a drawer behind them. And as he turned his head, his eyes landed on me for a moment, calm, calculating. And I knew instantly that this evening wasn't about love or family or future. It was about a deal. And my son was only one piece of it, maybe the easiest piece. And the man's first words confirmed it when he asked, is everything ready for tonight? And the girl nodded with a smile that never reached her eyes. And standing there in that living room, invisible by choice, but shaken all the same, I realized something chilling. I wasn't just watching a lie unfold. I was standing in the middle of a trap they were already setting. The man's presence changed the whole room, tightening the air in a way even they couldn't hide. And while they tried to look calm, I watched the girl smooth her hair and the mother straighten her blouse, small nervous movements that told me this man held more power over their plan than either of them. And when he walked further inside, he placed his briefcase on the table with a thud that felt too loud in the quiet room. Then he looked at me again, longer this time, as if he couldn't understand why a housekeeper was standing in the middle of their meeting. And before he could ask, the mother stepped in quickly, telling him I was just the help. And she motioned for me to move toward the kitchen, as if she wanted me out of sight. But I didn't move right away, because I wanted to catch the first words of their conversation. And the girl whispered that everything was on schedule, and they only needed the contract reviewed before her boyfriend, my son, arrived. And hearing the word contract made my hands curl into my sleeves, because relationships don't need contracts the way business deals do. And whatever they were planning, my son was walking into something far more dangerous than heartbreak. So I lowered my eyes and walked toward the kitchen slowly, keeping my steps soft so they would keep talking. And from behind the half-open door, I heard the man ask if the boy knew anything yet. And the girl laughed lightly, saying he was too sweet and too trusting to question anything. And I felt a sting behind my ribs, because that softness in him came from me, from the belief I taught him that people deserved kindness first. And now that same kindness was being used like a rope around his neck. And the man opened his briefcase, flipping pages loudly, and said that once the signature was done, they could move to the next stage. And the mother asked about the timeline, sounding impatient, almost greedy. And the man said everything depended on what they could pull from his access. And I didn't know if they meant bank accounts, documents, position, influence, or something even deeper. But every version of it was terrifying. And I leaned a little closer, pretending to check the stove so I could catch another sentence. But the moment I did, the man's voice dropped lower, so low I could barely make out the words. but I heard enough to freeze my breath. He said that my son didn't need to know the truth till after the transaction was complete, and the girl said she could keep him under control. And those words made me grip the counter, because they weren't planning a future with him. They were planning around him, using him, manipulating him. And when the mother asked what would happen if he refused or asked questions, the man said calmly, almost lazily, that they would handle it. And something in his tone told me that handle didn't mean comfort. It meant pressure, threats, maybe even something darker. And I knew then that I couldn't stay in the kitchen any longer, not as a passive listener, because whatever they were building was moving faster than I expected. And my son was walking toward this house with a heart full of trust, not knowing he was stepping into a deal that could take more from him than he could ever imagine. And as I turned away from the counter, pretending to clean a tray, the front door clicked again. Another arrival. And their voices shifted immediately, polite, charming, all masks sliding back into place. And I wiped my hands slowly as I heard a new voice enter the room, firm and familiar, and my stomach dropped because I recognized it instantly. It was my son. I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph on the wall, my son smiling, so innocent, completely unaware that he was now a piece in someone else's game. And the older man's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Make sure it's ready before he sees it. And her body froze, every part of her betraying panic, while she nodded quickly, whispering under her breath, "Yes, I'll handle it." But I could see the truth in her eyes. She didn't have control. Not really. And as I moved toward the living room, pretending to arrange the cushions, I noticed a small envelope tucked under the edge of a marble table, partially visible, with my son's name written in her handwriting. And my heart stopped, because the words on the front weren't casual. They were calculated. And I knew instinctively that if he opened it, my son would never see me the same way again. And just as I reached for it with careful fingers, the older man stepped closer, looking down at me, his gaze sharp, testing, almost like he could see the lie I wore on my sleeve. And she gasped softly behind him, a sound so fragile it made my chest tighten. And in that instant, I realized that every moment I had spent pretending to be a housekeeper had led me here, to a truth so dangerous that one wrong move could unravel everything I loved. And the seconds stretched painfully as I froze, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of secrets, betrayal, and a mother's instinct collide in a way that made my hands tremble. Because in that house, nothing was accidental, and everyone had a role except me, who had walked in pretending to be invisible, yet now held a key that could destroy them all. I held the envelope in my hands, every nerve screaming to either run or reveal what I had discovered. But I stayed still, pretending to fold the dish towels, while the older man's eyes flicked toward me, sharp and calculating, as if he could sense the truth behind my calm exterior. And she moved closer to him, whispering hurriedly, "It's nothing, just some old bills." But her words were empty, hollow, betraying the panic I already knew she felt. And my pulse raced, because I realized that this was bigger than me, bigger than my son. And if I didn't act carefully, everyone I loved could be caught in a trap they didn't even see coming. And as he reached for another folder on the counter, his fingers brushing mine slightly, as if testing my presence, I felt a surge of fear mixed with determination, because every moment here was a chance to gather the truth, a chance to protect my son before it was too late. And when he turned suddenly toward the window, his expression unreadable, I saw through the glass the sleek black car parked outside, someone else waiting, someone connected to this dangerous game. And I realized then that every move in this house was being watched, calculated, manipulated, and my heart ached thinking about my son, trusting and unaware, walking toward a storm he couldn't see. And as I carefully placed the envelope back under the marble table, I noticed a set of keys left carelessly on the counter. Keys that could open rooms he wasn't supposed to access yet, and a plan started forming in my mind. A quiet, deliberate plan to uncover the full extent of what they were hiding before it reached my son. Because every second I hesitated, every breath I took in silence, the risk grew higher, and I knew that one mistake could expose me. But if I succeeded, I could see the entire truth, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to protect him from the deception unfolding before our eyes. And as the older man spoke again, his tone calm but edged with menace, instructing her on the next steps, I realized that I was no longer just a passive observer. I had become a player in their twisted game, and the night was far from over, because the secrets this house held were only beginning to reveal themselves, and every shadow, every whispered command, every glance carried the weight of betrayal, and I had to navigate it all, one careful step at a time, before the truth destroyed everything. I kept my head low as I moved toward the hallway, pretending to dust the edges of the wall, but inside, every step felt like stepping deeper into a maze someone built with traps instead of doors. Because the moment I reached the corner, I noticed another detail: her phone vibrating on the console table, screen lighting up with a message preview she hadn't seen yet. And even from a distance, I caught the first few words: "Make sure he signs tonight before she interferes." My throat tightened, because she could only mean one person, me. And the fact that someone else outside this house knew I was here, knew I had stepped into their plans, meant I had less time than I thought. And before I could process it, she hurried toward the table, grabbing the phone quickly, trying to hide the message. But not before our eyes met, hers trembling, silently begging me not to ask what I already understood. And I watched her walk back toward the living room, where the older man reviewed more documents, his cold voice instructing her on what must be done before he arrives. And my mind raced, connecting pieces I never wanted to see fit together: contracts, hidden letters, signatures, a rushed deadline, and my son being the target of all of it. And I moved quietly toward the study door, slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of light to escape. And curiosity pulled me closer despite the risk, because if I didn't see what they were hiding, I wouldn't be able to protect him. And when I pushed it gently with my foot, the door widened just enough for me to glimpse a large binder open on the desk, filled with documents stamped with my son's name, agreements he had never mentioned, commitments he would never make willingly. And my breath caught when I saw a signature line at the bottom: "Not yet signed," which meant they were waiting for him to walk through the door tonight, waiting to corner him with something powerful enough to change his future. And as I leaned in a little more, my rag slipped from my hand and fell to the floor with a soft thud, echoing through the quiet house like a gunshot. And instantly footsteps rushed toward the study, heavy, fast, unforgiving, and I knew if I didn't move in the next second, everything I had kept hidden, my identity, my purpose, my son's only shield, would be exposed. I dropped to my knees, instantly, pretending to reach for the fallen rag, as footsteps thundered toward the study. And by the time the older man appeared in the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the room with suspicion, I kept my head bowed low, whispering an apologetic "Sorry, sir," in the soft, humble tone of a housekeeper, though inside my heart beat so violently it felt like the walls could hear it. And he stepped inside, his gaze drifting from me to the open binder on the desk, his jaw tightening with irritation, because he knew someone had seen what wasn't meant to be seen. And she rushed in behind him, her voice shaking as she said, "She didn't touch anything. She's new. She doesn't know the rules." But even as she defended me, I could sense her fear wasn't for me. It was for what he might discover. And the older man walked slowly around the desk, running his fingers over the edge of the binder before closing it with a firm snap that made my chest jolt, then turned toward her with a cold, quiet rage that told me he didn't believe a single word she said. And I could feel his suspicion shifting toward me, settling heavily like a weight on my back. But instead of confronting me, he stepped closer to her, lowering his voice to a warning tone that carried enough danger to chill the air. "If anything goes wrong tonight, you know who will pay for it." And she nodded quickly, eyes filling with dread. And as he walked out of the room, the silence he left behind felt like a trap tightening around all of us, because now I knew the truth. My son wasn't just being misled. He was being coerced, cornered, prepared for something he couldn't refuse. And the only person trying to keep the walls from closing in was the woman he thought he loved. A woman trapped herself between loyalty and fear. And as she turned toward me, shaking her head slightly, as if begging me not to push further, I realized I was standing in the center of a war I didn't fully understand yet. A war that would explode the moment my son walked through that front door. And the question that kept burning at the back of my mind was no longer what they were hiding. It was whether I could stop it before it swallowed him whole. I stayed kneeling on the floor for a moment longer, letting the tension settle just enough for me to breathe. But when she finally exhaled and whispered, "You shouldn't be here," her voice cracked in a way that told me she wasn't warning me for her sake. She was warning me for mine. And I rose slowly, dusting my hands on the apron, keeping my expression empty like any housekeeper would, even though inside I felt the pressure tightening with every passing second, because now I knew the moment my son stepped through that door, they would place those papers in front of him and corner him emotionally, financially, and maybe even legally. And she reached for the binder with trembling fingers, clutching it to her chest as though it burned her, and said, "They need him to sign tonight before he learns the truth." And her eyes flicked toward the hallway where the older man had disappeared, her voice dropping to a whisper, so thin I had to lean in to hear it. "He thinks you're wealthy enough to stop them." And hearing that made my breath catch, because it meant they had already investigated my family, already traced my son to me. And although she didn't know I was his mother standing inches away, she knew someone powerful was behind him, someone they feared, someone they wanted to get ahead of. And the irony of her pleading with the very woman she was talking about sent a chill through my stomach. But I kept my face calm, nodding as if I understood nothing. And she grabbed my wrist suddenly, tight, desperate, whispering, "Please, don't let him see that contract." And before I could respond, the front door handle clicked, a slow, heavy turning sound that made the entire house fall still. Because whoever was walking in now wasn't a guest, wasn't a neighbor. It was the very person the older man had been preparing for. And I turned my head instinctively, my pulse surging, because I recognized the pattern of those footsteps, the steady heel strikes, the familiar pause at the entrance, like someone surveying the space. And when the door finally swung open and the warm light spilled across the marble floor, I saw the shadow of my son stretch across the hallway, tall and trusting, completely unaware that every path in this house had already been laid out to trap him. And at that moment, the truth hit me with a force so sharp it stole my breath. I was out of time. The moment my son stepped inside, the house shifted, like the walls straightened themselves, like every shadow stood still. Because he brought a kind of light with him that didn't belong in a place built on secrets, and I forced myself to lower my head, keeping the brim of my cap shadowed over my face, praying he wouldn't recognize the shape of my posture, the rhythm of my breathing, the mother he had known his entire life hiding right there, inches from him, while he greeted them with that polite warmth he always carried, the kind that made him so easy to love and so easy to fool. And the older man walked toward him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, saying, "We've been waiting for you," while she stood behind him, her hands tight around that binder like a life vest she wasn't ready to let go of. And my son glanced around the room, confused by the tension he couldn't name, his gaze briefly brushing past me before moving on. "Thank God," and he said, "You sounded urgent. What's going on?" And the older man placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the dining table, where the contracts lay hidden under a polished leather folder. And as I followed them with slow, obedient footsteps, pretending to straighten cushions and adjust curtains, I caught the moment her face crumpled slightly, like watching him walk toward that folder was breaking something inside her, and she whispered so quietly I barely heard it, "Please don't do this, not like this." But the older man silenced her with a cold glance, then opened the folder in front of my son, sliding the document toward him with a smooth, practiced motion, saying, "Just a small agreement, nothing complicated." And my son leaned forward, unsuspecting, his eyes scanning the top lines, and I felt my stomach twist, because it wasn't a small agreement. It was a setup, a financial trap cleverly disguised as an opportunity, something that would bind him to their family in ways he could never escape. And before he could read further, the older man handed him a pen, saying, "Just sign, it's routine." And I could see my son hesitate, his instincts nudging him to slow down. But his trust kept pulling him forward, and as his fingers brushed the pen, I knew I had only seconds left before he crossed a line he wouldn't be able to undo. And standing there, invisible in my own son's life, I realized something terrifying. If I didn't intervene now, quietly, carefully, without revealing who I was, he would sign himself into a future built entirely on someone else's lies. My hands shook behind my back as I leaned slightly toward the table, pretending to adjust the vase of flowers, but every muscle in me screamed to move faster, to reach across the polished surface and pull the pen from my son's hand. Yet I couldn't, because revealing myself now would destroy the carefully crafted disguise I had built. And I watched him pause, just long enough for the older man to lean in, whispering something about deadlines, consequences, urgency, and my heart clenched, because those words weren't just empty, they were calculated, a precise manipulation designed to force my son's compliance. And she hovered behind the older man, face pale, eyes wide, hands twitching, as if she wanted to snatch the contract herself, but dared not. And I realized in that moment that she was trapped too, a prisoner of fear and loyalty. And my pulse hammered so loudly, I feared it would betray me. Yet somehow I stayed perfectly still, quiet, while the document sat between us, like a mine waiting to explode. And my son's eyes flicked up at me for a brief second, scanning the room, sensing something wrong, though he couldn't name it. And my breath caught, because that fleeting glance was a thread of connection, a lifeline I could use, if only I timed it right. And the older man noticed nothing, too confident in his control, too assured in the trap he had meticulously prepared. And when my son's hand hovered over the signature line, hesitation flickering in his expression, I felt a surge of both hope and terror, because I knew the next move would define everything: his future, our family, and the fragile mask I had spent hours constructing. And in that suspended moment, she leaned slightly toward him, whispering in a tone meant only for him, "It's okay, trust me." But her eyes flicked toward me, almost pleading, almost begging for intervention. And I realized she didn't know my role in this room, didn't know that I wasn't just a housekeeper, that I was the mother standing silent, watching the entire scheme unfold with a careful eye. And as my son's fingers touched the pen, ready to sign, the older man leaned back, smiling with dangerous satisfaction, and I felt a wave of urgency, so sharp it burned in my chest, because I knew that if I didn't act within the next heartbeat, he would hand himself over to their control. And nothing, not my warnings, not my presence, not my power, could reverse it after that. And in that instant, I made a choice that would change everything. A single decision whispered inside my mind that could either save him or shatter us completely. And I realized with a chill that in this house of secrets, deception, and silent threats, I was the only line standing between my son and a life written entirely by someone else. I stepped slightly closer under the guise of picking up a fallen napkin, but every step was a calculated risk, every breath a gamble, because the older man's sharp eyes scanned the room like a predator, searching for any sign of interference. And I could feel my son's tension rising, a subtle shift in his posture, the tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible hesitation in his hand as it hovered over the signature line. And I knew he sensed the danger, but didn't understand its source. And behind him, she fidgeted, clutching the binder to her chest, whispering soft, urgent reminders meant to distract him. Yet her own fear betrayed her, and I realized that even her loyalty to him was a chain keeping her from acting freely, keeping her trapped in their cruel game. And I had to act before the older man leaned in again, guiding my son with calculated authority, every word measured, every gesture meant to manipulate, to corner, to bind him to promises he hadn't fully comprehended. And I watched my son glance around the room again, scanning the walls, the furniture, the expensive paintings, as if searching for some invisible sign that something was off, that someone was there to protect him. And for a split second, our eyes met, mine hidden under the shadow of the cap, his wide with uncertainty, and I could see recognition, a fleeting spark, like a whisper of instinct, telling him that he wasn't alone, even though he couldn't place who I was. And that spark was all I needed to buy time, all I needed to force hesitation, to make him pause. And just as the older man shifted, preparing to push him again toward the pen, I cleared my throat softly, an unassuming sound, yet enough to make him glance at me for the briefest moment. And in that moment, I saw realization flicker across my son's face, confusion mixed with the instinct to trust. And it was enough for him to hesitate, enough to break the rhythm the older man relied on. And I could feel the tension in the room thicken, the air heavy with unspoken threats. And she exhaled a silent sigh of relief, though she didn't know why. And I stayed frozen, waiting for the next move, because I knew the slightest misstep could blow my cover, could ruin the chance to save him. And the older man, unaware, leaned closer, oblivious to the silent war unfolding in his own house. And I realized that from this point on, every second would count, every glance, every breath, every tiny motion, a potential weapon or liability. And in that precarious moment, I understood fully that the house I had stepped into as a pretend housekeeper had become a battlefield, one where my son's fate, my presence, and the truth itself hung in the balance. And one wrong move could destroy everything I was risking my life to protect. The silence in the room was almost deafening as my son's fingers hovered over the pen, the older man leaning in slightly, confident in the power he believed he held, while I remained crouched behind the couch, invisible, yet fully aware of every heartbeat, every shift in tension, every small glance that could betray my presence. And I realized in that instant how fragile this moment was, how a single misstep could trigger a chain reaction I could never undo. And as I watched my son blink, hesitate, the older man's lips curled into a faint, calculated smile, as if he had anticipated this pause. Yet he underestimated the invisible force in the room. Me, the mother who had trained herself to move silently, speak softly, think quickly, and act decisively. And she, the young woman who had been clutching the binder like a talisman, let out a small, almost imperceptible breath, a signal of both fear and hope, because she too sensed that something beyond her understanding was at play. And the older man's voice broke the quiet, low and persuasive, warning about time, opportunity, about how signatures once placed were impossible to retract. And my pulse jumped because I knew he was trying to impose urgency, to rush my son into a decision that wasn't his to make yet. And I felt the need to intervene, to stop the pen, to reveal just enough truth without shattering the carefully constructed illusion of being merely a housekeeper. And I shifted slightly, moving closer, pretending to adjust a silver tray on the sideboard, while keeping my eyes fixed on my son's face, reading every twitch, every micro-expression that told me he was beginning to sense manipulation, the faint tightening around his eyes, the slight furrow of his brow, the almost imperceptible lean away from the pen. And my heart surged, knowing I had reached the moment where subtlety could save him, where a small hint, a controlled movement, a carefully whispered phrase could break the older man's hold just enough to give him a choice, a fraction of power to reclaim what was being stolen from him. And I realized then, with terrifying clarity, that this house, with its gleaming floors, its rich decor, its carefully rehearsed lines of deceit, was a cage, a theater of manipulation. And I was the only one who could act from the shadows to guide my son out before he became trapped. And as the pen trembled in his fingers, ready to mark a fate he didn't yet understand, I took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing for the move that would either protect him or expose me completely. Because in that room filled with wealth, control, and lies, I was the invisible force that could change everything in a heartbeat. I felt the tension tighten around my chest like a vice as my son's hand lingered over the pen, hesitation flickering in his eyes, the older man leaning in with a faint, predatory smile, whispering reassurances that were more threats disguised as civility. And I inched closer under the guise of straightening a silver candlestick, every step calculated, every motion deliberate, because revealing too much, even accidentally, could ruin everything. And I caught her glance, she, who had been holding the binder as if it were a shield, eyes darting nervously between us, her posture rigid, her mask cracking for a brief second. And I realized that despite their careful plans, she was afraid too, bound by loyalty, fear, and the same intricate web of control the older man had spun. And the weight of it all pressed on me, a heavy truth that in this moment I was not just a mother, but a guardian in the shadows, the only one capable of saving my son from signing his life away without understanding. And as he paused, fingers brushing the pen, the older man's voice grew sharper, emphasizing urgency, consequence, opportunity slipping away, while my pulse thumped violently, my mind racing for a subtle move, a silent intervention, because one wrong word or motion could shatter my disguise and let them know I wasn't who they thought I was. And in that suspended instant, our eyes met, mine under the brim of the cap, his wide with confusion and instinctual recognition, that spark of something deep inside him, whispering that he wasn't alone, even though he couldn't place me. And it was enough to make him hesitate longer, long enough for me to prepare the next step, the delicate nudge that would shift the balance without revealing my presence. And as the older man leaned in, confident, unaware of the invisible force working against him, I sensed the room itself holding its breath, the air thick with tension, with anticipation. And I realized that my son was on the edge of a choice that would define his future, and that in this gilded house full of deception, privilege, and silent threats, I had become both actor and observer, a shadow moving among the opulence, waiting for the exact heartbeat when I could act, when the subtle touch, the careful whisper, or the smallest gesture would give him a chance to reclaim his power. And I knew, with terrifying clarity, that one misstep could expose me. But inaction would be far worse, because letting him sign meant giving them the victory, and I wouldn't allow that. Not when I was this close. Not when every second, every glance, every controlled breath counted toward saving him from a life designed by others. And in that frozen, perfect moment, I prepared to take the silent action that could alter everything. The older man's words echoed through the room like a low, menacing drum, each syllable calculated to pressure my son into compliance, while I crouched in the shadow of the ornate sideboard, pretending to dust a crystal vase, heart hammering in sync with the tension that hung thick in the air. And I watched my son's fingers hover uncertainly over the pen, the flicker of doubt in his eyes betraying the conflict raging inside him, the tug-of-war between the loyalty he felt for me and the subtle chains of manipulation the older man had wound around him, while the young woman fidgeted beside him, whispering instructions, her voice gentle, almost soothing, yet carrying the weight of coercion disguised as care. And I realized that she was as trapped as he was, bound by fear, by the unspoken rules of this house, by the invisible power structures that I had entered under false pretenses, a pretend housekeeper, yet fully present, fully aware, fully in control of the small leverage I had managed to carve for myself. And every breath I took was measured, every slight movement designed to remain unseen, yet strategically influence, to buy my son seconds of clarity in a room full of deception, while his eyes darted around, scanning the expensive surroundings, as if sensing that something was off, that some hidden hand could still protect him. And in that moment, I understood that the opulent walls, the gleaming floors, the heavy curtains, all of it was a stage, and we were players in a drama orchestrated by someone else. Yet I had a secret weapon: invisibility, patience, observation, and the ability to strike subtly, decisively, when the moment arrived. And then it did. The moment, as my son paused, breath catching, eyes widening, and I slid just a fraction closer, the weight of my presence pressing on him, though he couldn't identify me. A silent force guiding him toward the realization that he did not have to submit blindly, that the signature was his to refuse. And I saw the hesitation ripple across his features, a slight backward lean, a barely perceptible shake of the head, enough to break the older man's rhythm, to inject doubt into the carefully controlled scenario. And the older man's confidence faltered, his voice tightening, urgency creeping in as he repeated the consequences, his tone less smooth, revealing his reliance on momentum. And I felt a surge of hope, knowing that the invisible intervention, the smallest act, was beginning to work, giving my son the tiniest foothold to reclaim his decision, to fight against the manipulation that had been woven around him. And I stayed still, waiting, calculating, because in this delicate balance, every second, every look, every subtle movement counted. and I knew that if I acted too soon, I could ruin everything. But if I waited, if I guided him just enough, he could step back from the edge of a trap that had been set for him. And in that suspended, breathless silence, I prepared for the final, decisive move that would either save him completely or expose me entirely. The air in the room felt heavier with every passing second, charged with the kind of tension that makes your skin prickle and your stomach twist as my son's hand trembled slightly over the pen, caught between obligation and instinct while I remained crouched, pretending to straighten a vase, every muscle in my body taut, every breath measured, and I could see the older man's confident smirk beginning to falter as the hesitation in my son's eyes disrupted the rhythm he had relied on for control, while she, standing a step behind him, glanced nervously at the older man, sensing the subtle shift in power, her hand clutching the binder a little tighter. And in that moment, I realized that our roles in this intricate play were more fluid than I had imagined. My son, a young man trying to find courage; she, a woman unknowingly caught in a web of influence; the older man, the orchestrator of the trap; and me, invisible yet vigilant, the mother who had learned to observe, wait, and act at the precise moment. And I felt a surge of protective instinct, knowing I could no longer remain entirely passive. Yet, any overt action risked blowing my cover, the delicate disguise that allowed me to be present in a way no one else could. And then it happened, the smallest pivot in his posture, a micro-movement that betrayed his inner decision, and I leaned imperceptibly closer under the pretense of adjusting a candle, feeling the power of my silent presence guiding him, feeding him courage he didn't know he had. And I watched as the older man's voice, once smooth and commanding, grew sharper, more urgent, trying to reclaim control. But it was too late. The shift had occurred, the seed of defiance planted, and I felt a pulse of triumph mixed with fear, because the next seconds would decide everything, the balance so fragile it could shatter with a single wrong word, a single twitch. And I whispered a silent prayer that my son would sense the invisible guidance I was giving him, that he would trust the instinct that had been awakened, the tiny spark of defiance I had nurtured from the shadows. And as the pen hovered, quivering in his hand, I could feel time stretching, the moment suspended between what was expected and what could be. And I knew that the final decision, the act that would either free him or bind him, was about to unfold. And I braced myself, heart pounding, every nerve alert, for the instant when I would see him reclaim his power, step back from the edge of submission, and finally make the choice that would change everything, while the room remained silent, tense, and waiting, unaware that the invisible hand guiding him had been his mother all along. The moment stretched like a taut wire, trembling with the weight of everything that had led to it, the deception, the fear, the hidden observation, the careful nudges, and whispered guidance that no one could see. As my son's hand finally lifted away from the pen, a subtle shake of defiance that shattered the tension like glass, and I felt a flood of relief that almost made me forget the need for careful stealth, while the older man froze, eyes narrowing in disbelief, realizing too late that the plan he had so meticulously orchestrated was collapsing under the weight of a choice my son now owned, a choice guided by instincts he didn't fully understand, but which had been awakened by the invisible presence of his mother, crouched in shadows, heart pounding, nerves taut. And I could see the young woman beside him, faltering, her polite mask slipping as she caught the tension, realizing that the tables had shifted, that my silent intervention had tipped the balance in my son's favor. And I felt a surge of quiet triumph, tempered by the knowledge that exposure could undo everything But the impossible had been done. My son had reclaimed his agency in the very moment I had prepared for, and the older man, finally grasping the loss of control, tried to speak, to salvage authority, but my son's steady gaze cut through him, calm yet firm, a clarity he hadn't had before. And the silence that followed was deafening, filled with unspoken acknowledgement that the invisible hand shaping the outcome had been mine. And I allowed myself a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, a tiny exhale of victory and maternal pride as my son straightened, shoulders squared, eyes meeting mine across the room for a fleeting moment, recognition flickering there, unspoken but electric. And I knew he understood, even if he couldn't place me fully, that he had not been alone, that someone had guided him through the storm of manipulation. And as I rose from my hiding spot, under the guise of finishing my cleaning, adjusting a vase that no one had noticed, I felt the tension lift from my shoulders, replaced with a deep, quiet satisfaction that comes from protecting those you love when they cannot protect themselves. And when my son finally signed the papers on his own terms, without coercion, without pressure, the room exhaled with him, and I stepped outside, the cool air hitting my face, heart still racing, but filled with peace, knowing the danger had passed, the lesson had been learned, and the bond between mother and son, though tested and unseen, had emerged stronger than any obstacle. And as I walked away from the house, leaving the world oblivious to my presence, I whispered to myself, share, subscribe, a small nod to those who watch, who understand, who witness stories of love, protection, and courage, and then softly, thank you, and see you in next video, because every hidden victory deserves acknowledgement, even if it is only for the heart that beats quietly behind the scenes, guiding, protecting, and winning without being seen.